Hello, everyone. I'm George Kors, and today, yes, we're talking about what is soon to be a very relevant and popular novel, Vineland by Thomas Pynchon. That's right, we are talking about the novel that is loosely being adapted by Paul Thomas Anderson into One Battle After Another. We will be diving deep into Pynchon's, maybe possibly one of his more controversial novels amongst Pynchon fans. Um, and I'm really looking forward to talking about that with you folks. Thank you for joining me today. Can't wait to have you here. Before we get started, big announcements on the channel. I'm sure everybody has seen already. But the best way to support me, as I always say, is to buy my work. And that's right. My new novel, Sing Lazarus, is out. You can buy it. Here's the manuscript. Yeah, this is the first printed edition ever. You can buy it now. Links down below. Also, if you want to buy my debut that came out 10 years ago, Always the Wanderer, if you're looking for that. Hey, look, if you're looking for experimental fiction, look no further. That's what I do. That's why I make these videos. That's why we're here. And to be engaged in the literary tradition. Everybody who supports me, thank you so much. It means a lot that you support me, and I notice when you actually buy and engage my novels. That is a huge deal to every single writer out there, especially those of us published by small presses. Huge deal. Thank you. So let's go back to Thomas Pynchon's Vineland. I did not write in this copy. My copy's falling apart. It's real dinky, and beaten up. I buy most of my books used, so that's probably why. But as I said up top, Paul Thomas Anderson is coming out with a film in September of 2025 called One Battle After Another. And this film has been confirmed to be loosely adapted from this novel. So I'm making this video because I know a lot of folks, whether you be new to fiction, whether you be new to Pynchon, whether you be a lifelong reader, whether you're sort of a flash in the pan person, however you're coming to literature, a lot of folks are going to be curious about this novel. So I thought I would do a deep dive. I read this novel with the homies last year. We had a fun time reading it together in our little book club. And at first, I wasn't going to do a deep dive at all about Vineland, and didn't really have a desire to. One is because, you know, I don't necessarily want to do a deep dive on everything, and this isn't like a Pynchon fan channel. I know that there's a lot of Thomas Pynchon like fans out there, especially amongst the lit bros, and the brodernists and these various cohorts online. And that doesn't really describe me. I love Gravity's Rainbow, and I love a lot of Pynchon's work, but it doesn't really describe me as being a really devout Pynchon fan. So I did not make a deep dive at the time. And in the intervening time, learning about One Battle After Another, I thought that I would, especially after watching the trailer. And I have not seen the film, so I cannot do anything but speculate. But having seen the trailer and seen a lot of the commentary, I would imagine, and maybe you can check me on this. Maybe you're watching this in the future and you have seen the film. But I would imagine that the adaptation here is very loose. The tone of the trailer, at least, is not at all the tone of the novel. And that is saying a lot. Because, as I said, Vineland can be a rather controversial novel amongst Pynchon fans. Gravity's Rainbow came out in, I believe, 1972, early 1970s, and he did not publish anything besides Slow Learner, which is a short stories collection, in the intervening time. Vineland comes out in 1990, so it takes quite a long time for there to be another Pynchon novel, and Vineland is the start of that second phase of Pynchon's sort of novel writing career, which has a lot of similarities, of course, with V, and which, by the way, I have a video on V listed down below if you want to check it out, which I think is a supremely excellent introduction into Thomas Pynchon's sort of stylistic meanderings. Um, V, Crying of Lot 49, Gravity's Rainbow. There's a lot to love there. There's a lot of really excellent work there. And then starting with Vineland and going on, we have the latter novels that he's published, including one that's coming out. Which makes me wonder if Pynchon has died and this is being published posthumously. But that's a hot take. I don't know how everybody feels about that. And Paul Thomas Anderson has adapted Pynchon before, and that that is as folks like it. Inherent Vice. I have not read Inherent Vice. I've seen the film. The film wasn't really to my liking. I do like Paul Thomas Anderson's films, but Inherent Vice just didn't really do it for me too much. Um, but in light of that, and in light of a lot of folks really probably going to have a desire to understand more about Vineland, I thought I'd make this deep dive. And going into that controversy with the Pynchon fans, why some Thomas Pynchon folks might be a little who have read most of his works might be a little bit more uncertain about Vineland, is it does have a little bit of a perception to be a little sort of Pynchon light, Pynchon easy mode, perhaps, which I think is reductive in everything, because a lot of, if not all of those same tropes, whether those be of language and language play and zaniness and obsession with pop culture that we see in other novels, those remain here to be sure. That sort of postmodernist play, that quintessentially postmodernist play with language and with pop culture, is absolutely a major part of Vineland. But there is a different tone, to be sure. And what's more, the novel is really, really supremely zany. It is a romp through and through. And I think if you've read Vineland and then you watched the trailer of One Battle After Another, I think there was a little bit of head scratching amongst those readers of Vineland. Because it is a very different tone, and even just the opening scenes, the opening sequence of Vineland is really silly. It is supremely silly, and retains that silliness throughout most of it. And a lot of folks will call Vineland satire. They'll call it political satire. However you're sort of ascribing this sort of postmodernist novel, the biggest thing that I can think of to describe it well and easily for the layman is it is a romp. And Thomas Pynchon is known for the romp. In my opinion, there is a lot of silliness in all of Pynchon's works, and Vineland perhaps contains the most silliness of any of the works of his that I have read. And to that end, I would say maybe some of the more serious Pynchon fans out there who really love something like Gravity's Rainbow, for example, may not be so enamored with it, because it really does possess a deeply zany quality and has an opening sequence that is really ridiculous and zany. And we are focusing here initially in the novel on Zoid Wheeler, and there's this core family around Zoid that is sort of the crux of the novel, and I'll sort of hesitate in calling them main characters for a lot of reasons, just because of how they appear in the novel at different times. But we have this sort of core family unit of Zoid Wheeler, Free and Easy, Gates, and so they're a couple who have since broken up. All right, they're sort of maybe they were never married, sort of maybe they're a divorced couple, and then they have a daughter named Prairie Wheeler. So Zoid is the opening character of this family who appears, and Zoid is this sort of hippie freak burnout who's living in a sort of fictionalized Humboldt County, California, which is Vineland County, California, and has this long and tumultuous history with drug use and the hippie movement and free love and revolution and all of this sort of 1960s political and social upheaval, um, which is a very defining part of Zoid as a character. Zoid the Void, he represents and has engaged with a ton of these various different hippie or hippie adjacent social movements. And we see that, throughout the novel, throughout especially the opening, and just, the sort of history that we get about Zoid and his life and his experiences. The other most significant member of the family that appears throughout is Prairie Wheeler, Prayer Wheel. Okay, we're getting these hippie, connections in here. And she is Zoid's 14-year-old daughter with Free and Easy. Free and Easy, free love. We're getting this. to make a lot of these connections, I know Pynchon's prose can be kind of dense. I will drop a link down below of annotations that you can check out for all of Pynchon's works, but Vineland is included in that. So you can sort of take a look through there. The Vineland annotations are okay in this link. They're not like exhaustive or anything that I would say is like a very peer-reviewed academic type manuscript per se, but they're very helpful. They can be very helpful, particularly with pop culture references. So we have this core family, and we're experiencing this. It's set in 1984 in Northern California. Obviously, with its pension, so there's flashbacks. Um, and the timeline is, of course, all over the place in terms of flashing back to the 1960s and flashing back to other experiences that folks have and so on and so forth. So, you can, it's not necessarily sort of a straight line, which we should expect considering the post-modernity of somebody like Thomas Pynchon. Zoid himself, this sort of freak burnout hippie guy, eventually is sort of tangled up in this horrible, long-standing issue with a couple of very notable federal cops. Hector Zuniga, who is there first, who is this sort of like television addicted weirdo federale cop, and sort of is this representative that is sort of underlying throughout the novel of this kind of addiction to television and this sort of obsession with television. Television is a huge symbol throughout the novel. And Hector is definitely a major player in how that sort of depiction of the use and interaction with television is created within the work. And then the much more prominent to the storyline and overarching character arc of Zoid and the family and Free and Easy and Prairie is Brock Vond, who is this almost like he has like endless amounts of federal government money to do whatever he wants in the war on drugs. And as the sort of action unfolds in Vineland, a lot of the commentary here is this sort of spoofing of the war on drugs, and sort of looking at that Reagan era, particularly because it's set in 1994, but that Reagan era war on drugs sort of ideation and that major cultural movement and political movement that was taking place in the United States at that time. Now, is that war on drugs discussion going to be, the major takeaway that everybody's going to have? I think that's going to be hit or miss, but it's definitely there. That's one of those things that sort of hits you over the head. Is the setting in 1984, just the how the characters consume drugs, how everybody talks about drugs, in this interrelation between these burned out hippie freaks and the federal cops who show up from the DEA and otherwise. And we also see that interaction between these folks, these like hippie folks in the 1980s, and who are all burnt out by that point. Zoid, chief amongst them, of course, and others. We also see in flashbacks with other characters. There's a really great character who's named Weed, which is hilarious. Weed Atman, I believe is his name. And we see their interactions with cops back in the 1960s, in the late 1960s as well. So we're having this longer commentary on policing and power and the exertion of power in the United States, to be sure. And Zoid, to a large extent, flouts a lot of the sort of typical U.S. American conventions for, society and how one lives a life and how they live a life well and how they parent and all of this. And Free and Easy as well. Although Free and Easy, is a complicated character because she's a turncoat. She's double agent, so she ends up working with the police and Brock Vond, and ends up being Brock Vond's lover. And this whole entire love triangle that develops between Vond and Free and Easy and Zoid is really, this sort of uniquely pop culture American situation here. It almost reads like a television show at times, which is a frequent takeaway I had throughout the text with the prose. Is one of the things that I noticed time and time again was using tropes kind of like that love triangle trope. Of course, there's all sorts of other very pop culture focused tropes and ideas throughout the novel. That's something that's rife here, but television in particular and different kinds of television tropes are here in a major way throughout the novel. So if you are a big, watcher of classic TV of 1960s and 1970s and 1980s television, I think reading Vineland will be fun because there'll be so many different references that you get in there, not only to specific television shows, but also to commercials and all sorts of other stuff in there that Pynchon is pulling from television and popular culture surrounding television and using in the novel. So that's something that's in there. But yeah, so we have this sort of love triangle between Free and Easy and Vachbrand and Brock Bond, pardon me, and Zoid Wheeler. That is sort of this interchange of power and masculinity. I don't know that there's a lot of thoughtful masculinity study stuff to gain from here. A lot of what's going on here is pretty stereotypical. There's some objectification of women, to be sure, and some objectification of the very young Prairie Wheeler, to be sure, that's in here. But I don't think we're looking to Thomas Pynchon for significant feminism, for example, or anything like that, or really progressive gender role stuff, for example. But we do have that sort of prototypical U.S. American machismo and some of the characters, particularly in Brock Bond. I think there's a lot of that sort of over the top, sort of cop oriented machismo that's in there with a character like Brock. And so we have this sort of relationship from that is like, Free and Easy, her relationship with Zoid, and then her eventual relationship with Brock, and how all of that interacts, and this sort of love triangle is a major arc within the narrative within the novel. And another major arc we have here is sort of to the present day of 1984 within the novel, as Brock comes looking for Zoid again to finally get him this time. We have Prairie Wheeler going off on her own sort of journey and learning, which I think is actually really interesting. She's, she doesn't know very much about her mother. She lives with Zoid, and she goes on her own journey, sort of learning about her mother and the things that her mother did and the revolutionary acts that she did and how she betrayed her friends and all of this. And that is a very interesting journey. And there's a lot of 1980s specific pop culture that goes into Prairie's journey. And I think Prairie's journey is really, really interesting. She isn't this sort of hippie burnout freak that her father is, but she has a lot of very significant 1980s specific tropes. So if you like something like Stranger Things, for example, because of its 1980s-ness, because of how it captures the sort of, pardon the usage, zeitgeist of that time, then you might like Vineland, because Prairie's journey is really zany in and of itself, and also is reflective of a lot of 1980s pop culture. So there's a ton going on here in terms of what is happening in Vineland with this core family, and then by proxy their interactions with cops and different revolutionaries and burnouts and drug users and so forth. And the war on drugs, I think, is the most superficial and easiest way to look at this politically, and way to look at this as political satire. And the war on drugs, and then Reagan sort of as a larger looming figure there. I think that those are the two easiest inroads here to a political discourse about Vineland. I think for me, in my reading, what was much more significant than War on Drugs, even though War on Drugs is the obvious one, just because it's set in 1984, because Reagan was such a major figure, because there's so much drug use, because there's DA, because of all these obvious things. But what was much more significant and nuanced for me was a commentary on the failure of the hippie movement. Um, a lot of the characters that we see had this long-standing, almost revolutionary tradition to them. Revolutionary in the 1960s sense. So these social, political revolutions, whether they be gender or sexuality or sex or drugs, um, many of the characters here, Zoid, Free and Easy, Weed Atman among them, all have this sort of connection, this interconnection with that sort of alleged revolutionary spirit of 1960s, particularly 1960s California. And I think there's a lot to be said about the shortcomings socially and historically of those various movements from the 1960s. And I think Thomas Pynchon's sharpest knife, if we're thinking about Pynchon as a critic, is for these sort of hippie free love movements and these, like, social and political revolutions put forward by the hippies. Um, I think that in Vineland, Pynchon is very biting and very acerbic when it comes to criticizing, although perhaps in an underhanded way, the manner with which these hippie movements failed and failed utterly. Zoid, I think, is the biggest and most significant representation of this. Absolutely fails at revolution, loses his partner to the DEA agent. It really is just evocative of Pynchon admitting maybe that these Northern and Southern California movements that were, worldwide, of course, but that were happening significantly in San Francisco, happening significantly in Los Angeles, happening significantly in a place like Humboldt County, that these movements, these hippie social movements, were utter failures, and that they had significant shortcomings, that they had like no clear thesis or philosophy. And I think that to me was what was most surprising and effervescent about the novel, because I think, when you read the opening sequence with Zoid and him crashing through windows and wielding a chainsaw, and the local news being here, and all this sort of weirdness, and I've said this word maybe too many times here in this discussion, this deep dive, but the zaniness. Um, at the end of the day, as we go through the novel, when we peel back some of the layers of that silliness and these pop culture tropes, we do end up finding actually a relatively well thought out and serious critique of those social revolutions in the 1960s, and how those social revolutions, are actually maybe a lot more conservative, are actually a lot more exploitative than they claimed to be. And I thought that was relatively well done. I think, it's important for us to think about, the social movements in our cultures, and where are their lackings? Where can we improve in the future? And I wouldn't always say, hey, let's go look to Thomas Pynchon for somebody who's going to advise on something like political activism in the United States, for example. But with Vineland, we do see how, a movement like this free love movement, this sort of like uninhibited social movement of the hippies, ends up supporting folks like the DEA, ends up supporting folks like Reagan and the war on drugs. And we see the sort of interconnectedness of things here, which is a phrase that I use sometimes, that interconnectedness of things, and how these sort of disparate paths end up connecting, which I thought was really, really interesting, and might be, to me, the most substantive part here. I don't know that I am willing to call this Pynchon easy mode like some folks are. I do think it's more approachable maybe than something like Gravity's Rainbow, but it's a lot shorter, to be sure. Um, However, it does contain a lot of those same Pynchon-esque tropes that we see time and time again in his writing, where we lose sight of a main character, and maybe that main character never comes back again, where we might not be able to assign a main character. We have the songs that pop in time and time again. We have jumping back and forth between timelines and locations and perspectives. All of this sort of um, deep sort of spider webbiness of Pynchon's writing is present here. So to say, hey, this is going to be easier for you to read than Gravity's Rainbow, maybe, but I still think the prose is rather challenging, and the sort of layout of the narrative is not so straightforward, which is sort of a classic, you know, factor of a lot of Pynchon's novels. So I don't know that I would go so far as to say this is easy Pynchon, which, because I think, maybe his prose is dense throughout his career. But I would say, maybe on the surface, maybe it's easier to read than Gravity's Rainbow. That said, I do think that there's something to be got out of here about that commentary about the hippie movement. Even if the hippie movement sort of commentary and digging that deep doesn't work for you, I think that you're going to get this war on drugs commentary that is, pardon me, prevalent throughout the entirety of the work. It is really, really present, and you can't miss it. You really, really can't miss it. The other sort of aspect about Vineland that I would talk about that I think would be maybe of interest to folks is I think Vineland is a very solid California novel. Um, Particularly if you've been around Humboldt County. One of the friends I read this with lives in Humboldt County and wanted to read this because of how much it mirrors that. But if you have been in really Northern California before, or if you've been in Southern California, this novel is set primarily there. It's set primarily in Northern California, sort of Humboldt County area, in this fictionalized Vineland County, and then it's set also in Southern California, sort of in like an Orange County, almost towards San Diego type SoCal setting. Um, and if you're looking for the California novel that you want to dig into that has all sorts of weirdo California tropes to it, I really do think Vineland is probably the one to go to, because it just has that kind of California flavoring to it. It really does. It does seem like Pynchon's writing California. Seems like Pynchon is known to have lived in California. Seems like he's writing a little bit of those experiences there into Vineland, and I think that can be really provocative. So if you're interested in something like that, I think Vineland is a worthy read. Going back to our prompt here in the beginning, is this going to be similar to One Battle After Another, Paul Thomas Anderson? Time is yet to tell on that. And like I said, maybe you're watching in the future, and you can tell us in the comments if it lines up or not. But my guess, having read the novel and read a bit about the One Battle After Another and seen the trailer, my guess is that it'll be a very loose adaptation. Maybe we'll have themes of revolution. Maybe we'll have themes, of Zoid being a burnout. I don't even know if his name will be Zoid in the movie. I don't even know if Prairie Wheeler or Free and Easy will retain the same names. It's possible. It's possible that Paul Thomas Anderson zeroes in on something like the revolutionary spirit. Maybe with a title like One Battle After Another, but that's just me speculating. I don't know. I can't say until September when folks watch the movie. There's a lot going on here. Honestly, I think it's a fairly fun and silly novel. I don't think for all of the political satire and criticism commentary that might be had here. It's really silly, and there's just so much silliness, especially because of the focus on the pop culture and television. Television pop culture specifically is really silly. It's really corporate. It's really zany and kooky and weird. And I think that there's a lot of that in Vineland. And I think that you can just have a fun time reading it. It can be a pretty low stakes Pynchon read, in my opinion, for that reason. And maybe that's why folks see Vineland as a little bit easier of a novel to read. But I still, the prose is still really dense. There's still a lot going on. And the timeline's really all over the place as well. So, I just say, have your expectations here, and we'll see. Am I going to watch One Battle After Another? I don't know. Maybe. We'll see. In the meantime, I loved reading Vineland with my friends. I thought it was a really fun book club book, especially was fun to read folks who haven't read Pynchon before, experiencing Pynchon with Vineland. Let's talk about some recommendations I have if you liked Vineland. Um, First one I have is the Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. Tess Gunty, to my opinion, does kind of have it has a very kind of postmodernist feel to her writing, and the Rabbit Hutch with its like sort of main character, the sort of zany mystical quality of the main character in here, um, I think really reminds me of Zoid. So if you're interested in that, now I will say this is much more contemporary, but it does have that kind of like almost ethereal weirdness that Zoid has in a main character here, which I think is pretty fun. There's also a significant focus on Hildegard von Bingen, which I don't know if you are up on your Catholic mystics or not, but this is definitely one that is interesting here. Also, a lot of commentary on violence in this novel. Actually, lots of commentary on violence in all three novels that I'm presenting here. The second of these is going to be a novel that I've done a deep dive on, which is A Brief History of Seven Killings. And one of the reasons why I recommend this is not zany at all. In between these two novels, Brief History of Seven Killings is not zany one bit. But it does include a lot of commentary on like 1960s, 1970s U.S. CIA involvement in Jamaica. So if that Brock Vond, kind of federal agent thread in Vineland is really of interest to you, maybe A Brief History of Seven Killings might be of interest as well, because it also includes that CIA bit, which can kind of have a lot of those sort of political commentaries in there, if you're interested in something like that. And then the last one is, and Marlon James is just a great writer. It's a really beautiful book. And then the last one I have is from Viet, Nguyen, which is The Sympathizer, which has been made into a TV show, I believe. And Nguyen does a pretty good job here. Also, another work that has this sort of clandestine CIA agent interaction going on here, and a lot of commentary there as well about how governments exert power violently, which is something you're going to see in Brief History of Seven Killings, as well as in just the violence commentary in Gunty's work there. None of those novels is as zany as Vineland is. I think the Rabbit Hutch and the Sympathizer have silliness. They have some, a little bit more tongue in cheek maybe than something like A Brief History of Seven Killings does, but they don't achieve the same zaniness as Vineland. And I was trying to think of recommendations that have that kind of zany Pynchon stuff to it. And really all I could think of was other Pynchon novels. So I'm not recommending for zaniness today. I'm recommending for other themes. I hope that if you are really a fan of Paul Thomas Anderson, that you give Vineland a read. I think it probably is a good idea to check out the source material, especially if my hunch is correct and the film is very different from Vineland. I think understanding what at least in passing what Pynchon was going after in this novel might be a worthy endeavor in your practice of the arts and your engagement with the arts, and hopefully that is relevant to you. And let me know down below if you're watching this in the future. Let us know about the film down below, and see, was I correct to assume, or was it a very faithful adaptation? I doubt it, but maybe it is. I've been wrong before. I'll be wrong again. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Please, please, please support me if you like these videos. Look, go buy Sing Lazarus. It's out right now. Links down below. It makes a difference. Supporting small independent presses is a huge deal right now, and supporting authors like me who are out here still practicing the literary arts in a major way is a huge deal. If you want, you can check out Always the Wonder as well. Those links are down below. You can visit my website, find out more about me as a scholar, thinker, person at georgecoors.com. And you can find me on socials that I may or may not use at GBK7288. I hope your reading practice is going well. I hope you're engaging in the literary arts in a thoughtful and meaningful way. And yeah, sound off down in the comments below. I would love to know what your thoughts are about Vineland and the forthcoming movie. Thank you so much, folks, for watching, and have a safe day.